Hello everyone, it's Saoirse, and I am really tired. Going from National Novel Writing Month and writing every single day to the holiday season and all that that entails, I feel like I have not slept, which isn't true, I have slept. Um, but man, I am exhausted. And today I just want to read you some excerpts from things I wrote during NaNoWriMo. I would love to know if anybody else participated. This year I did it a little bit differently. The first few years I really went in, the traditional way and wrote a novel, or the first 50,000 words of a novel, or a memoir. And this year I found that I couldn't focus on one single story. I really intended to go back to a story that I wrote for grad school and keep extending it into a novel, but my brain was like, we're not going to focus on one thing. So I wrote about a dozen stories or beginnings of stories that all totaled up to 50,000 words. And I was quite pleased with that because I haven't really written in a long time, like nothing substantial and nothing I felt good about. So it was really, really cool and sometimes stressful to take that time every day last month and write around 1,600 words a day. So I'm going to share some of these things with you. Most of them are excerpts, some are the whole thing. And bear with me because this is probably going to be a little bit of a long video. So I'm going to start with a story that I began months ago and then kind of dropped off. I only wrote like 9 pages, and then I extended it into basically a novella. It's over 60 pages. And I did that during the first week of NaNoWriMo, and I had a really fun time with that. It is called We Are Putting the Women Off in Boats, and you'll see what it's about. I'm really stoked about it. Okay, I'll read you the first few pages. All of the survivors are dead. Father looked up from his laptop and set his cup of black tea on the table. They all survived and they're all dead now. It's remarkable. I rustled in the fridge. I wanted Swiss cheese. Not Brie, not Gruyere or Gouda, just Swiss. Darling, Father said, did you hear me? I said it's remarkable. I swiped the Swiss and shut the fridge. He wanted an answer. Yes, it's so sad. Father picked up his tea again and took a long sip, smacking his lips and doing his solemn face, eyes downcast, brows knitted together and lifting up in the middle, mournful, thoughtful, meditative. Sad, he said, but that's the way of things. We are no more alive than they were on that night, and our deaths will not make a louder sound than theirs. Tea sip, lip smack, brow knit. I tore off a chunk of cheese and chewed it, sensing him about to slip into a soliloquy. Mother will want to know, I said. Quite right, go fetch her, won't you? I suspect she'll be in the garden at this hour. Taking the cheese, I walked down the hall, into the conservatory and out the back door, followed by the sound of Father's fingers pounding the laptop keys. Kitty bounded to greet me, nosing the hand holding the cheese. I ripped off a piece for her and patted her floppy ears as she swallowed it in one big wet gulp. I knelt and let her lick my face before she went tearing off across the grass. I spotted Mother in the distance, waist deep in rose bushes. I knew she hadn't seen me. She always became a sort of garden creature out there, in her element. I don't think she ever forgave me for not expressing hysterical excitement when we began our botany unit when I was 7. Arthur didn't care much either, but he was always the better actor, better at keeping the peace. He never said a word to the neighbor kids who called us homeschooled freaks. He didn't let the air out of their bike tires like I did, and he certainly didn't sprinkle the sidewalk with tiny stones and watch the kids fall on their roller skates. Walking across the grass as if it were a bed of eggshells, I headed for the roses. Mother, I said. She didn't look up. Mother? She straightened, swatting her sweaty bangs out of her eyes. The shears in her right hand flashed in the morning sun. I watched the light glinting off the blades. My body swayed and I noticed how dry my mouth was. The taste of Swiss held firm to my sandpapery tongue. Milvina Dean is dead. There, I'd said it. I waited for the gasp, but it didn't come. My mother, who never underreacted to anything, just looked at me, then down at her shears, opening and closing them. A breeze blew through the old oak tree, and Kitty squatted to pee beneath it. "Well," said Mother, "I suppose we knew this day was coming soon." I nodded. The woman had been 97 years old. Of course we'd known it was coming. I was sure Mother still thought of Milvina as a minuscule 8-week-old bundle, held tightly and fussed over in the lifeboat, the great ship far away and slipping into the Black Sea beneath a moonless sky. I figured she'd mourn her the way she'd mourn the unjust death of an infant. "Well," Mother said again, "that's that." She dropped the shears to the ground with a soft thud and clapped her dirty gardening gloves together. "Does Arthur know yet?" "No, I haven't seen him since I got up." "Ah," she said, "that's right. I sent him to the store. We were out of bread." She eyed the cheese in my hand. I tightened my fist around it. "You'll spoil your dinner." "It's morning." "Excuse me?" Her eyebrow shot up, the left one, the meaner one. "It's nothing," I said. "I only had a bite. I'll put it away now." She watched me for a moment before seeming to lose interest. She bent to smell the roses, her eyes hard and unblinking. Kitty padded toward me and nosed the cheese again. I ran with her back to the house and herded her inside, shutting out the garden and Mother and the shears and the roses. I sat on the porch swing, kicking my feet back and forth. Weekends were always like this. Arthur would go off and do an errand and stay out far longer than the errand warranted. I'd sit on the front porch drinking lemonade like an old southern widow, watching the neighborhood strays hunting for lizards in the bushes. Kids across the street played games in their front yard. If they were throwing a ball and it landed on our property, one of two things always happened. Sometimes the children would exchange a glance with each other, and then look at our house and me on the porch, and then go inside for the rest of the day. Or if they had braver friends over, the friends would march onto our lawn and shout something like, "Have your parents drowned themselves yet?" And they'd saunter back across the street with the ball. My throat used to get tight when this happened. My eyes would fill up, and I'd sit and stare the kids down without blinking, until the tears dried and my eyes felt like withered little potato chips at the bottom of the bag. When they finally went inside, so did I. I couldn't let them win by caving first. As I got older, though, their comments had less effect on me. I did my tricks with their bike tires and the stones on the sidewalk, and then I became bored with all of it. I settled into my 17-year-old Southern widow persona, and I sipped my lemonade, and I waited for Arthur. Sometimes I read a book, but mostly I just sat, away from the sound of Mother and Father debating the value of the latest find from the debris field, or how many years the ship had left before the sea devoured it. Sometimes Jenny sat on my lap purring, and Kitty lay at my feet, all of us safe with the screened porch keeping the outside out and the front door keeping my parents in. The sun was starting to slip behind the back of the house by the time Arthur appeared on the brick path, a grocery bag on his shoulder. "Hey," he said. "Hey. Got you something." "Yeah?" I stood up and held the screen door for him. He dropped the bag on the creaky porch planks and rustled around in it. "It's not much," he said. He held out his hand and dropped a fruit leather into my palm. "Cherry flavor." He took out one for himself, blueberry, and we sat on the swing and peeled off the wrappers. "I should probably tell you before you go inside," I started. Arthur turned his deep blue eyes to me, waiting, chewing. "Milvina Dean died." "Oh," he said softly through the fruit leather. He swallowed and thought for a moment before saying, "Well, now they're not going to shut up for a month." I smiled. He was right. Any single event related to the disaster meant weeks of conjecturing, speculating, research, talks with the society, new units for us to study. It wasn't like Arthur and I didn't care, of course we did. But we'd stopped being consumed about a year before. I remember the day. We'd been sitting on the porch as usual, and Arthur just stopped swinging and said, "They're crazy, aren't they, Molly Brown?" I had looked at him, afraid to say anything at first. I just nodded, and then I started crying, and he hugged me, and I knew that everything would be okay as long as it was us against them. I put the last of the fruit leather in my mouth, and reached for the two neatly stapled papers under the porch swing. "Father printed this," I said. "You can read it if you want." Arthur took the article and ran his finger over the headline. "Milvina Dean, Titanic's last survivor, dies at 97. Okay, that's all I'm going to read from that one. It's a Titanic story. Are we surprised? Look at my little Titanic. I loved writing this one. It involved so much research, and I would have on my computer tabs pulled up of Like, what was the menu on the Titanic? What were the curtains made out of? How many, whatever. It was a lot of fun research that involved me, going down the rabbit hole rather than writing a lot of the time. Okay, the next one I didn't finish, and I was bummed about that because I really liked the beginning. But I had this idea. I come up with ideas throughout the year and like write down little notes in my phone. And usually it'll be like one line or like a specific part of a paragraph. Sometimes it's not even the concept for the whole story. But I had a concept for this and it just didn't like flesh out in the end. Hopefully I'll finish it eventually, but I only wrote about 18 pages. I'll just read you the first few. This is called Timeshare. The day is finally here. Time for 3 blissful weeks by the lake. No need to worry about filing things on time, or filing them with the correct department, or filing them physically and virtually. For God's sake, John, how many times have I told you? Are you a dinosaur? Were you born in the Mesozoic era? How hard is it to understand that we have a virtual filing system? No more of that for 3 whole weeks. Not that John minded his job. Gotta bring home the bacon, ha. Besides, he'd been at it so long, he probably wouldn't know what to do with himself Monday through Friday if no one was telling him where to file things. He'd probably try to file his socks into his t-shirt drawer, and no one wants that. Better to just keep working. That's the thing when you have 2 kids, the work just never stops. First you're working to keep them in diapers, then you're working to buy them the best sneakers so they don't get made fun of this year, then you're working to send them to college so they can learn useful things that might help them with their own jobs. John's twins were 18, and he was already preparing what he'd say to them when he dropped them off at their universities in the fall. See you soon, champ. Don't forget to call, darling. Your mother and I are so proud of you. Your mother! Crap! He'd forgotten to pack the surprise for Joanne. No worries, he'd just shove it into one of the cracks in the Tetris-tight trunk. It would be easy to slip it in there. It was just a beach towel. A beach towel with a picture of the whole family all standing out on the dock at the lake house last year. How neat is that? Who knew you could order things like that on the internet? Joanne was going to love it, especially because this was their last summer before sending the kids off, and truth be told, she was taking it pretty hard. Janie and Joey had both chosen out-of-state universities. Joanne just couldn't understand it. What if the washer broke in their dorm? Where would they do their laundry if they couldn't just come home every week? Could they be trusted to buy vegetables? What if, God forbid, some of the other kids tried to sell them marijuana? Joanne was inconsolable. John tried to be strong for both of them, but he was starting to have a strange feeling that if his kids left, he'd leave too. Not physically, not for real, but maybe his very essence would walk out the front door and leave just a shell formerly known as John sitting on the couch, glassy eyes looking in the direction of the TV. Ho ho, better not go there. That's dangerous territory, that is. John's father would have whipped him with his black leather belt if he'd heard him get so sentimental. Luckily, the old codger kicked the bucket before the twins started middle school. Best not to celebrate his death, though. John was a good son and had every intention of remaining a good son, even with no parents left to beat him or praise him. He'd never speak ill of them out loud. There were certain ways to behave and ways not to behave, and John liked to believe he displayed the correct ways to his kids. He only ever wanted to give them the best chance at life, perhaps an easier path than he'd had. And the first step to a good life was to be a decent person, to have a good moral code. That's just common sense. John loved to talk about ethics. He'd gotten a degree in moral philosophy, and received many beatings and a 9-year banishment for it. And he loved nothing more than to sit around a warm, cozy room and chat about Kant and Hume and Bentham and all the rest. And he could really get going if you gave him a chance. Pour him a glass of wine, and after half an hour or so, he could have the whole party heartily agreeing with him about the dangers of utilitarian ethics. They'd all be singing the praises of deontology, everyone piping up to share a story about a time when they had to make a difficult choice, and the right thing to do wasn't so clear. If only John had been there, everyone would laugh and cheers, and John would feel so pleasantly enamored of the company he kept. Such good people. John hummed a little tune while he stuffed the towel into the trunk. Then he headed back inside to wake everyone up. He'd offered to make some eggs before they hit the road, but he knew they'd all be craving Cracker Barrel, especially Joanne. She just couldn't get enough of that hash brown casserole. So it would be best to fork out the extra cash and eat out for breakfast, even though that cash was hard-earned and John would have to do a lot of filing to make more of it. even though John always had terrible intestinal problems after eating at Cracker Barrel, and he'd have to make several emergency stops on the way to the lake. Best to get Joanne that casserole. Happy wife, happy life. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Maybe I'll get back to that one. I don't know, it got so out of hand because there ended up being so many characters in that story. And I'm used to writing very character-driven, like one character, first-person narratives. So it felt like a bit too much, too overwhelming. Okay, the next one. There were a lot of days during NaNoWriMo where I was just like, I'm not feeling continuing the thing that I was working on yesterday. I can't do it. I'm just going to start something new. And so I would write, 4 or 5 pages, a little short story, because that was about the word count that you need to get every day. And it was a good exercise to make myself write things that I wouldn't normally write, genres I wouldn't normally write. Oh my goodness. So I started this one, and it was fun kind of starting with one sentence and then not really having any idea where it was going to go. This is called Teatime. I run breathless through the woods. No matter how many times I run, I can't figure out how to keep my breath going in and out without hitching in my chest. I know my face is red. I can feel the blood fighting to pump its way to my cheeks, an outward signal to anyone who might pass that I'm a girl who doesn't know how to breathe properly. But no one's going to pass. No one is ever in the woods this early. A bird sings somewhere to my right, but in a moment I've passed it and the song is gone. Sometimes I want to slow down and hear these things, but the feeling of my bare feet squishing along in the mud is too intoxicating to resist. If I change my pace at all, the squishing changes too. It won't be the same squishing I'm used to. Occasionally I step on sharp sticks or little stones, but my feet are so tough now I just acknowledge I've stepped on something sharp and I keep running. There's no point in giving the idea of pain any more notice than that. I pick up a hint of the scent of a baking pie, and I remember I'm close to the cottage. I run a little faster. I wouldn't want the pie to burn because of my carelessness. At the cottage, I wipe my feet on the mat and creak the door open. Sure enough, the pie smells just about done. I can almost taste it on the air. My cat weaves between my legs and then leads me to her food dish. I deposit some fresh fish in it and watch for a moment while she eats. I appreciate the way her tiny teeth tear at the fish, flaking it off into digestible pieces. Turning to the oven, I grab the mitts and remove the pie. It's a good one, I have to say. Apple with some lemon juice added for extra tartness. I don't know how I'm going to save any of it for my friend, but I'll have to control myself. He won't be here for a few hours. I allow myself a single slice now while the pie is hot. I burn my tongue slightly, but that's the price I pay for impatience and delicious pie. It's always worth it. It's not the kind of burn that lingers. I rekindle the fire in the hearth. Then I feel warm and sleepy. I decide to take a morning nap with my cat, and we curl up in the window seat. It's starting to snow outside, a light, dusty snow that probably won't last long on the ground once the sun rises higher. My nap lasts longer than I expected, and I hop up from the window seat when my bleary eyes figure out what the clock is showing. I change into my tea time dress, cream linen with puff sleeves. I put a maroon apron over it and tie the strings. Before long, there's a knock at the door, and I let my friend in. He shakes a dusting of snow off his feathers before entering. He ducks his head and comes inside, remarking at how much he appreciates the cozy fire I have going in the hearth. I smile and tell him he's always welcome to share my fire. I think he's blushing, but it's hard to tell because of all the black feathers. He looks at the bare floorboards and smiles, and I think that's his version of blushing. I tell him to take a seat at the table, and he does. My cat jumps up onto his lap, turns a few circles, and curls into a ball. He strokes her back with his wing. I love seeing them together. I wonder if my cat knows he's different. Clearly, if she knows, she doesn't care at all. She's a very accepting little creature. Doesn't seem to question much. I wish I was more like her. I pull the pie out of the oven, where I'd left it with the heat on very low so it would stay warm. The gooey apple filling is bubbling through the lattice. I cut 2 slices and put them on the prettiest plates I have, white china with pink flowers around the edges. My friend looks up from the cat when I set the plates on the table. I can tell he's excited by the way his feathers ruffle slightly. He lowers his beak to the plate and inhales. He tells me the pie smells more delicious than a fresh pine forest, and he asks if I grew the apples myself. I tell him I did, and that I'd be happy to show him my orchard sometime. His black eyes brighten and he nods, telling me that he'd love to see it. I hand him a cotton napkin and lay my own on my lap. We begin eating, and I'm trying to be a little slower than I was earlier when I ate my overly hot slice. I know he wouldn't mind a bit if I devoured the pie in 2 bites. But it's early days, and I'm nervous about showing him a side of me that I'm not too happy with myself. The way he holds the fork in his wing is so delicate and beautiful, I feel like crying. I don't mention it, because he's probably had to deal with a lot of people mentioning a lot of things about his appearance and the way he does things. I wouldn't want to be just one more person who makes him feel different. So that one was kind of fun. I guess it's sort of magical realism. I'm picturing this woman who lives in this forest, and her friend is like a giant raven, which it just feels so quaint and nice and simple in a way, which is unlike the more depressing things I usually write. So that was a nice cozy bit of a story there. Moving into the more depressing, I've been wanting to write this memoir piece for a long time, and I'm still not sure that I really have got the format that I like, but I started this kind of experimental piece where I'm addressing the reader, and I kind of like how it turned out, but it's incredibly personal, so I'm not going to read more than like the first little bit, less than a page. It's called Grandfather and Son. Son is spelled S-U-N. I want to tell it, but maybe there's nothing to tell. A footnote in the history of humanity. Each of us clawing through the murky wasteland of our inner selves, hoping just one other being will understand us, never accepting that we are not as unique as we imagine. Being alone is not the same as being original. Still, I want to tell it. Would you listen? Even if I struggle to translate vague thought to crisp black letters on a page, would you listen? It looks so clear in my brain. Please let me scoop it out for you. Please, please let me. Let me lobotomize myself and lay it bare. Let it lie between us, crystalline and perfect, not the raw, wet, cerebral mess that actually lives in my skull. I promise if I separate the words from the organ, it will make more sense. Trust me. Just let me pull it all apart and give it to you. Just let it speak for itself, because my fingers ache from dragging the ragged strings of the story out of their coward's lair. I want to rest. That's all I'm going to read of that. You ever write something where you've wanted to write it forever, and then it still just doesn't come out the way that you were hoping? Yeah, that's pretty much everything I write. Okay, this next one, I have no idea where this idea came from. It was one of those days where I was just like, I need to write something to get my word count, and I don't really care what it is. And I ended up kind of liking it. This is called Midterm. Tom woke up in his bed, except he was sure it wasn't his bed. He was sure it was a pile of snakes. But that was a normal morning thought for him. He often dreamed about being constricted in a pile of snakes. At least 12 different serpents all wrapping themselves around his body, squeezing until the air left his lungs and the blood stopped traveling through his veins. In these dreams, Tom never died. He would just keep getting squeezed harder and harder until he eventually woke up. It was unpleasant, to say the least. He told his mom about the dreams, which made him feel a little pathetic. He normally wouldn't tell his mom about any dreams he had, because she was a fortune teller, and she was known to make much out of very little. Not that she'd ever exaggerate anything that involved her own son. She wouldn't make up grand and terrible stories about what his snake dreams might mean. Still, he waited a very long time before telling her, just in case she got carried away. In the end, she told him it probably meant he was stressed from trying to take on too many things academically, and the snakes represented each endeavor slowly squeezing the life out of him. She thought Tom was drowning in his AP classes and all his responsibilities for the National Honor Society and the French Club and the track team. She figured the snakes were telling him to take a step back before the stress killed him. Tom tried to take this to heart, but he just couldn't bring himself to give anything up. What if he missed out on his top college because he'd decided to drop French Club at the 11th hour? Surely bad dreams were an okay price to pay for admission into the best school. So he soldiered on. He tried counting the snakes, naming them, categorizing them by the color of their scales. He did all this while they squeezed him to near death. He was practically lucid dreaming by this point, but not to the extent that he could stop the actual constriction from happening. That was unavoidable. So when Tom woke in his bed and realized it was not in fact a pile of snakes, he sighed with relief and also irritation, because honestly this repetition was getting old. He pictured himself at 83, waking up in some lonely house, grateful to realize his bed was not snakes. Tom didn't think he could stand to dream the same thing for so long. Granted, this had only been going on for 6 months, and he had no reason to believe it would last forever, but all bad feelings and situations seem permanent when you're a highly stressed teenager trying to balance academics with extracurriculars and family and a social life and sometimes even dating. Tom hadn't attempted dating in a few months, since Alyssa broke up with him. He'd really fallen for her, and he hadn't seen it coming when she left. In his mind, they'd been having a great time, and he was managing to take her on dates while studying for exams and writing college entrance essays. In her mind, she was basically non-existent to Tom, because he was so focused on school. She didn't mind at first, she told him, but when he fell asleep every time she came over, she decided to remove herself from his pile of stress snakes. He told her about the dreams when he started having them. She couldn't stand to be the reason he was losing sleep, trying to stay up so he'd have time for her, when the honest fact was there weren't enough hours in the day for him to have time for everything he was trying to do. Tom missed her the most in the morning, when he first opened his eyes and tried to figure out how he was going to make himself get out of bed. This paralyzing feeling he experienced sort of seemed like depression, but he told himself he didn't have time to be depressed. Depression slows everything down. If Tom slowed down, he wouldn't accomplish anything. He definitely couldn't be on the track team. No, Tom had to remain fast, very fast. So even though his limbs were sluggish, and he had a hitch in his throat that meant he needed to cry, Tom pulled himself to a seated position and then turned his body, pulling the covers off in the same motion. When his feet touched the floor, he recoiled at the cold. His mom had turned the heat off again. Over and over, he told her that the cold made his nightmares worse, but she insisted it was healthier to sleep cold. And he wasn't the one paying for the heating, so he didn't argue. One day, he'd pay for everything. That was the plan. But first he had to get into college, and then get through it. Tom gagged and almost threw up at this thought. Not only did he have to survive the stress of getting into a school, he then had to actually learn the campus, attend classes, do homework, write papers, conduct research, and all the rest. Tom fell back onto the bed, extremely dizzy now with racing thoughts. After college, he'd have to get through grad school. How could he possibly handle it when AP classes were almost too much? And forget about the PhD, he could never cope with the stress of that amount of work. But he had to do it. He'd promised his dad that he'd take care of his mom, and this was how he was going to manage it. He was going to be so successful, he could afford to help his mom with her business. It wasn't easy being a freelance fortune teller. She told him often how not easy it was. But she never wanted to put any extra weight on his shoulders, so she tended to stop herself in the middle of a sentence when she realized she'd begun to complain. Making another attempt to stand, Tom stumbled forward until his hands found his dresser. From on top of it, he picked up the clothes he'd laid out the night before. Jeans and a faded red t-shirt. No fuss. He'd have to dress nicer in college, so he was being a bit of a slouch now as a gift to himself. One last hurrah before he really buckled down. After he got dressed, Tom walked down the hall to the kitchen, where his mom was already sitting with her coffee reading the paper. She still got the paper every day, insisting that screens withheld the knowledge that paper granted freely. Tom had tried to argue that the words were the same whether printed or not, but his mother had just shaken her head, a very disappointed look on her face. "Good morning," Tom said. "Morning, love. Sleep well?" "Not really." "Snakes again?" Tom nodded and poured himself a bowl of whole grain Cheerios. This scene had been the same every morning for months, and he was so very tired of it all. He'd thought maybe switching to a new cereal would help, but he got used to the Cheerios in 2 days, and now he was unbearably bored again. Sometimes while he sat at the table eating breakfast, waiting for the whole horrible day to begin, he felt he'd rather be in that pile of snakes, feeling their smooth, heavy bodies crushing his ribs beyond all repair. That's it. Just a fun little story about the stress of academia. I was never as much of an overachiever as Tom, but I pressured myself so much in school. Nobody was telling me to put that much pressure on myself. But I did it anyway. By the time I got to grad school, I simply didn't care anymore. because I realize how ridiculous academia is. It's just a big old circus. So do what you want and make time for the things you love. Okay, this next one, I'll just read the first couple pages. This was like a sort of therapeutic story where I wrote it for a few days, just kind of checking in with these characters and, you know, making them have a fun time in this cool place that I would like to be in. I really have a lot of love for Tarzan and any stories about like shipwrecks or tree houses, or the jungle, or being on a desert island. So this story is called Treehouse, and there's not a lot of stakes involved. It just was a nice thing to write. The possibility of a shipwreck had always been there, but the likelihood of it, very low. People who are afraid of boats have the same kind of fear as people who are afraid of planes. Very few ships wreck, very few planes crash, but it's easy to fear dying in a spectacular and catastrophic way, one where you see the end coming and have enough time to panic and weep before you die. So people cling to these fears, when really they're so much more likely to die in a car crash. But here's the thing about car crashes. They happen all the time, sometimes in front of us. We're used to them. Of course, they're no less shocking and traumatic if they happen to us, but while they still exist as that thing that happens every day to other people and often slows down traffic and makes us late for work, it's easy to become numb to them. And if you're a woman, you're more likely to die at the hands of your partner than in a shipwreck or plane crash. And anyone at all is more likely to die from food poisoning, falling from a ladder, drowning in a bath, being blown up by fireworks, and being hit by lightning. Death is waiting around every corner, but it doesn't often linger on ships and planes. Anyway, my ship fucking wrecked last summer, and I've been living in the jungle ever since. So on one hand, I was right not to worry about dying in a wreck. I just hadn't considered surviving one, and how annoying it would be. Don't get me wrong, my human survival instinct was dancing a jig when I dragged my mangled body from the water and pulled myself along, clawing fistfuls of wet sand until I lay on the beach, spent and cursing. But the rational part of me, the part that would take the little cyanide pill if an enemy invasion were coming, was pretty pissed to have to deal with the mess. I'm not kidding about how much of a mess it was. Not just my body, but the ship. Pieces of it continued to float to shore, beaching themselves in piles of seemingly useless debris. Every morning, I'd wake beneath the shelter I'd made from banana leaves and walk out to the water where I'd invariably find a new piece of wreckage. It was really great being faced with the source of my trauma and also my greatest failure on a daily basis. Usually, I just turned around and went back to my shelter, willing myself to get the strength to gather water in the lagoon I'd found, or to try and spear some fish. I was still working out which plants would kill me by microdosing on each one of them. I wasn't sure this was an accurate way to go about it, but I was hoping I'd be like a cat eating a trace amount of garlic and surviving. Or maybe I was hoping I would die, like that kid who went into the Alaskan wilds in that Krakauer book. Either way felt like a win to me, and it's important to feel like you can't lose, especially in a situation that is very much hopeless. So the debris. Usually I ignored it, but then one morning I woke at sunrise and sat on the beach and watched the wreckage of my hopes and dreams wash up beneath a blood-red sky, with rays of light shooting into the golden clouds like bold spears into shiny scaled fish. And I thought, shit, I could do something with this. It took me weeks to get my strength back enough to start dragging the debris further up the beach, but enough fish and coconuts were doing the trick, and the exercise to procure this nourishment was beginning to cut deep lines of definition between my muscles. I liked the muscles, but I could have done without the scraped, bleeding inner thighs and torn-up palms from climbing trees to get coconuts. I sometimes looked at my thighs and laughed, thinking about how I used to buy little packages of organic coconut chunks for $3.50 at a well-lit, air-conditioned grocery store. Sometimes I'd forget I'd opened one of these packages, and the perfectly white chunks would rot in the fridge. I had so much fun with that one. Okay, last one. This one I'm probably, along with the Titanic one, I'm like most excited about in terms of potential and like feeling like it kind of wrote itself. Like this concept came out of nowhere for me, and usually I will sit on an idea for a story for years, at least months. But on this day, I just opened up a document and this started happening. And that's the kind of like crap that you hear writers say, or artists, like, the painting painted itself or something, the book wrote itself. And when you feel really stuck or you have writer's block, that can really piss you off. So it's a very magical feeling when something just comes out of you, and it doesn't feel like pulling teeth, because so much of the time it feels like pulling teeth. So this is called Victoriana. I'll read you the first few pages. Everything started with the house. The obsession, the risks, all the questionable things I did, the reason I'm here now writing this statement. It can all be traced back to the day I first saw the house. I was working as a cleaner at the time, family business. I was 23 and my parents had sent me out to meet a new client, assess her needs, etc. I followed my GPS to the nice part of town. Chain-link fences, dirt lots, and crumbling shacks slid past my windows and were replaced by brick roads and wrought iron gates and lush, vibrant flower beds. It was a nice day in early autumn. The leaves weren't changing yet, but the harsh heat of summer was gone, and it was possible to breathe again without the humidity coating the inside of your lungs. I drove with my windows cracked, welcoming the coming cold. The destination is on your left, the pleasant female voice of my GPS told me once I'd been driving down a street shaded with enormous oaks for a couple minutes. I turned into the driveway, stopping at the closed gate. I rolled my window down the rest of the way and pushed the call button. No voice came over the speaker. The gate just opened, as if the old woman had been waiting by the buzzer. I parked my car and got out, shading my eyes as I looked up at the house. You'd have to see it to believe it. It'll never sound as good in my words, but I'll try my best to describe it. It was a Queen Anne Victorian, pale pink like the tiny leotard I wore before I had to quit ballet because we ran out of money. Its trim was all in white, precious gingerbread trim across the whole wraparound porch, with wagon wheel brackets hugging each beam. It was 2 stories, and a stout tower jutted out of the right side, proudly reaching skyward. Stained glass shone in the largest window on the main floor. Everything carved and grand and spotless. Rocking chairs and overflowing flower baskets graced the white wooden porch. The front double doors were at least 8 feet tall and painted a mint green. I didn't have words for some of the fanciful accents, each one joining together in a picture so ornate that should have been chaos, but somehow felt regal, like a princess bedazzled in all her finery. The whole house was sweeter than ice cream. I wanted to lick it. Before approaching the final steps, I felt something like a swoop of lust deep in my belly. I touched a hand to my stomach and licked my lips. Straightening my white polo shirt, I walked toward the house, craning my neck back to take it all in. I tripped on the bottom step and righted myself by grabbing the railing. My first contact with the house. My palm buzzed and goosebumps swept over my arm. When I reached the top step, one of the front doors creaked open and a tall, thin woman stepped out onto the porch. "You must be Hannah," she said. She had an old film star kind of voice, the sort of transatlantic accent developed for the screen. Her aged appearance didn't match the youthful tone, and I felt myself staring rudely. "Yes," I said, "I'm Hannah with Barron Family Cleaners, and you're Mrs. Farrell? Call me Grace." "Grace, nice to meet you." "Likewise. Come in, come in." She gestured with one arm, the bell sleeve of her red knit cardigan swaying. I bowed my head and followed her into the house, removing my white keds just inside the door. Grace laughed. "Oh, you really are from a family of tidy people." I pasted a prim smile on my face and nodded. I wasn't sure yet what kind of repartee we would have, whether it was okay to use the quick wit and snappy retorts that some of the clients enjoyed. I stood with my hands clasped at my waist, not allowing myself to take in my surroundings yet. I needed to be given permission. My hungry eyes wanted to roam, and I gave them free rein as soon as Grace swept a hand through the air and said, "Well, this is it." I didn't know where to look first. I started with the ceiling, and held my breath as I took in the coffered pattern surrounding an oval cut out with a mural of a cloudy sky. A crystal chandelier hung down from the center of the oval, directly above an elaborately carved entrance table topped with a vase of roses. Beneath my feet were dark, narrow floorboards that I imagined must have been original. In front of me was a staircase stretching up to the 2nd floor, the wall beside it crowded with black and white photos in bubble glass frames. The walls. How can I describe the walls? Just in the foyer alone, the walls were enough to make me feel a desperate urge to sit and catch my breath. Wooden panels covered the lower half, then an intricate chair rail separated the wood from a gorgeous creamy yellow floral wallpaper that reached to the ceiling, where it met the most fantastical crown molding I've ever seen. Every single inch was considered in the design. Everywhere the eye looked, it was met with artistry and delectable detail. I thought of the hands that must have lovingly applied that wallpaper, caressing and smoothing it until it was perfect. "It's beautiful," I said, hating that word for not living up to what it was describing. "What year was it built?" "It was designed by my grandfather in 1894, a present to my grandmother." I tried to imagine receiving a present anything like that house. I felt like I could vomit from the envy. "My mother lived here all her life, and so have I," Grace continued. "What about your children?" I asked, forgetting my pretend polite demeanor. "I never had any," Grace said simply. "But who's going to get the house when you die?" I barely managed to keep from asking a string of impertinent questions about the house. My heart was racing with the effort of subduing myself. I pinched my arm, trying to remember the purpose of my visit. "Well," I said, "I am aware that you inquired about our organizational services as well as cleaning." "That's right," Grace nodded. I took a small notepad and a pen from my back pocket. "I'm just going to take some notes while you show me around. It'll help me decide what to bring next time. Organizing baskets, the right kind of vacuum for your floors, that sort of thing." I clicked the pen and wrote "Feral House" on the pad. The scratching of the pen echoed terribly in the grand foyer, and I wished Grace would say something. I felt her observing me in a way strangely devoid of judgment. For the next hour I followed Grace around the house, trailing after her like a child afraid to lose its mother at the grocery store. But what I really feared was that if I didn't stay close to her, I might just break away and run madly through the house, pressing my body against every wall and fondling every antique object in sight. The discipline it took to remain with her made my knees weak. I scribbled notes in the kitchen, the pantry, the parlor, and each of the 6 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. In the library I nearly fainted and had to ask if it was all right if I sat. Grace ushered me onto a red velvet settee, a concerned expression animating the wrinkles on her face. "I'm sorry," I told her. "I don't think I've had enough water today." Truthfully, I was perfectly hydrated. It was the sight of the soaring bookshelves that sent me over the edge. The spine of each book teased me, begging for the touch of my fingertips. By the time we reached the foyer again, I did feel thirsty and my stomach growled with hunger. I gave Grace an estimate for her first organizing session and a weekly cleaning with 1 deep clean per month. She deemed it reasonable, shook my hand, and opened the front door for me. I put my shoes back on and left. I tried not to look back at the house as I walked to my car. The afternoon sun was beginning to feel very hot, and I touched my hand to my forehead, wondering if I was coming down with a fever. The whole drive back to my house passed without me seeing anything. When I finally parked in my driveway, I realized that I couldn't remember a single moment of the drive, and I panicked, thinking I might have actually made it home with my eyes closed. I checked my back and front bumper just in case any signs of an accident had appeared, but the car looked fine. Shaken, I locked it and looked up at my house. Previously innocuous, the place where I lived now appeared odious and loathsome to me, a simple ranch-style home from the 50s when no one cared about style and design became utilitarian. The plasticky siding was the kind of gray that could have just been a filthy white. I walked up the cement path to the door and spit into the ugly hedge under the front window. Inside, I hung my keys on a hook and removed my shoes. My parents were out cleaning at the Myers house. It usually took them most of the day. I padded over to the couch in my socked feet, flopping down next to our elderly cat, Clara. She looked up at me with her soulful eyes, twitching her striped tail while I scratched her head. I stared at the black television, lost in images of the house. I lifted my hips and pulled the pen and pad from my back pocket. Without thinking, I flipped to the next clean page and began to sketch. Each page became a little portrait of a single detail in the house. 1 page for a vase I saw in the kitchen, 1 page for the curtains over the tall window in the library, 1 page for the pointed ceiling of the finished attic. I drew until Clara left the couch and the sun went down and I couldn't see the paper anymore. When my parents opened the front door, I screamed. That was so much reading. Okay, if you actually stuck around for all of that, thank you so much. I am just very pleased that I managed to keep up with NaNo this year. It was a whole lot of work and sometimes a lot of fun and sometimes very frustrating. I wrote quite a bit with my mom as well. She was participating loosely, and we even did the NaNoWriMo Disney event, which I did a little video about. I'm already thinking, how am I going to do this next year? It was so much work, and there were days where my brain was just like, you don't know words and you have no ideas, and like writing at that level and having that many sentences go through your brain in a single day and putting them all down on paper, it's a lot. It's a lot, especially, I don't know, like for an introvert like me, it feels like I'm hanging out with dozens of characters all the time, and that can be stressful. But it's also a very interesting way to socialize, you know, with fictional people that you came up with. So, yeah. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you wrote any stories last month, if you wrote a novel last month, and I will see you all next time, I think, for some more Christmas content. So, in the meantime, happy reading.